No one tells the full story about Russia's shadow fleet, but the U.S. Navy exposed it in the harshest possible way. At 3:14 a.m. in the Bay of Biscay, aboard the French aircraft carrier Charles de Gaulle, a young radar technician stared at what looked like a ghost on the screen. A small drone with a very low radar signature had just launched from the deck of the Eagle, a Russian Project 864 intelligence ship posing as a research vessel only 12 miles away. The drone was closing fast at 145 miles per hour. Inside the Combat Information Center, the tactical action officer had only 18 seconds to decide whether this was a surveillance pass or the start of a direct strike. If that drone carried just 5 pounds of explosives and slammed into a parked Rafale M on the flight deck, the French flagship could be taken out of action. But the French were not alone. 50 miles to the north, the USS Arleigh Burke had already picked up the track through a satellite data link. The Russian commander aboard the Yagal likely believed he was testing NATO's response time. He was about to learn that the response would be more than quick. It would be absolute. To understand why the U.S. Navy answered with such force, you have to go back 3 weeks to the North Sea. The British frigate HMS Richmond had been shadowing a group of Russian Shadow Fleet tankers, uninsured, aging vessels that Russia reportedly uses to get around oil sanctions. These ships, identified by the International Institute for Strategic Studies as a serious security concern, were not just moving oil, they were also carrying sensors. Without warning, HMS Richmond's bridge was hit by a powerful optical dazzler, essentially a military-grade laser fired from a Russian tug trailing the tankers. The goal was not to sink the frigate. It was to blind the crew and damage the ship's electro-optical systems. For 45 seconds, the British warship was effectively operating without sight in one of the busiest shipping lanes in the world. Moscow used that incident to measure NATO's hesitation gap. They wanted to see whether the British would respond with force or back off. When the British followed standard maritime procedure and issued a diplomatic protest, the Kremlin seems to have taken that as permission to keep pushing. They assumed NATO was too constrained by rules of engagement to answer grey zone pressure. That was their first major mistake. While Russia was studying the British response, the US Sixth Fleet was already updating engagement software across its Atlantic destroyers. They were building a connected battlespace designed to turn Russia's hybrid tactics into a high-speed trap. Then came the Bay of Biscay. The Eagle incident, reported by Defense Express and Defense UA, marked the moment Russia moved beyond laser harassment and into something far more dangerous. By sending a drone directly toward a French carrier during the Polaris exercise, Russia crossed from intimidation into clear kinetic signaling. In the eyes of the U.S. Navy, that changed everything. You do not target a carrier, the centerpiece of NATO power projection, and expect a polite warning over the radio. The Eagle was not a traditional warship. It was an intelligence platform packed with antennas and signal collection systems built to absorb Western electronic signatures. By launching the drone, the Russians were likely trying to force Charles de Gaulle to activate its high-powered fire control radars. The idea was simple. Send a drone worth around $10,000, force the French to light up radar systems worth hundreds of millions, record those frequencies, and hand the data over to electronic warfare specialists back in Kaliningrad. Low cost, high reward. But the U.S. Navy had no intention of letting the French switch those radars on. Inside the USS Arleigh Burke, the Aegis combat system was operating in passive multi-static mode, a capability Russia may not have expected. Instead of broadcasting a signal the Russians could detect, the destroyer simply listened to radio energy already present in the environment. Commercial satellite transmissions, television signals, even emissions from the Russian ship's own navigation radar. By measuring how those waves reflected off the incoming drone, the U.S. destroyer built a firing solution without transmitting a single watt of energy. At 3:16 a.m., the tactical action officer aboard Arleigh Burke gave the order. Batteries release, bird away! A Mark 41 vertical launch cell burst open, and a RIM-162 ESSM tore into the night sky. This was not a routine intercept. The missile was guided using a remote track supported by the French carrier's passive infrared sensors. That is what the modern networked battlespace looks like in action. The Americans fired the weapon, but the French provided the eyes. The Russian drone barely had time to react. The ESSM, able to pull 50 Gs and travel at more than 1,900 miles per hour, struck it 5 miles from the carrier. The explosion was small, the message was not, and that was only the beginning. The U.S. Navy did not just remove the drone, it moved to shut down the entire threat system. 2 EA-18G Growlers, already circling 30,000 feet above the Bay of Biscay, descended toward the Eagle. They did not launch missiles. They launched electronic attack. The pilots activated ALQ-218 tactical jamming pods and concentrated a narrow, high-intensity beam of electronic interference directly at the Russian ship's antenna array. What happened next on the Yagal was chaos. Screens across the ship's signals intelligence suite reportedly washed out in white glare. Their satellite link to Moscow was cut. Internal communications filled with piercing feedback. In less than 3 minutes, one of Russia's most advanced spy ships in the Atlantic had been reduced to a floating platform with almost no useful awareness. And then the sea itself added a message. Roughly 400 yards off the Yigel's starboard bow, the surface began to churn. A black steel tower rose out of the water, then a hull, then 560 feet of nuclear-powered presence. The USS Florida, an Ohio-class guided missile submarine, executed a tactical surface. For a submarine to surface that close to an opposing ship means one thing. It had been there for hours, maybe longer, and the other side never knew. USS Florida carries 154 Tomahawk cruise missiles. By surfacing, the U.S. Navy was delivering a blunt signal to the Russian commander. We did not just see your drone, we have been under your shadow the entire time, ready long before you made your move. To make the point even clearer, USS Arleigh Burke accelerated to 34 miles per hour and began a fast dominant circle around the Russian vessel. It did not just remain nearby. Its Mark 45 deck gun was trained directly on the Yigal's bridge. The destroyer also established fire control lock with its RIM-66 standard MR system. Though usually used for air defense, that missile also has a secondary surface strike role capable of tearing through a ship's upper structure in moments. The Russian commander could see American sailors on deck. He could see the optics tracking every movement. He was trapped in every dimension, jammed from the air, monitored from the surface, and shadowed from below. The IISS assessment of Russia's shadow fleet warns that these vessels are hybrid threats, blending military objectives with the appearance of civilian trade. But in the Bay of Biscay, the U.S. Navy proved that disguise only works when no one is truly watching. NATO has shifted toward full-spectrum transparency. With systems like the RIM-174 standard ERAM, one of the most flexible missiles in the world, capable of engaging ballistic threats, cruise missiles, sea-skimming targets, and even ships over the horizon, the U.S. Navy has built a defensive bubble that is extremely difficult to penetrate. During this encounter, Arleigh Burke reportedly had multiple RIM-174 missiles on immediate standby. If Russia had launched a second drone or attempted any defensive fire, the response could have landed before the Russian action fully developed. But the real answer that night was not just missiles, it was coordination. Russia's entire strategy depends on NATO being divided. They assumed the laser incident involving the British would remain separate from what happened with the French. They assumed the United States would stay out of a French-Russian confrontation. Instead, they ran into an alliance operating like a single organism. The British supplied intelligence on Russian laser tactics. The French supplied sensor data on the drone. The Americans supplied the missile that ended the immediate threat. At that point, the Shadow Fleet stopped being a shadow. More than 600 tankers, research ships, and support vessels are now being tracked with growing precision by NATO systems. Their engine signatures, radio habits, and hull vibration patterns are increasingly part of Western databases. Russia tried to use civilian-looking shipping to gain an advantage. Instead, it helped NATO build a map of its covert maritime network. The deeper reason Russia failed comes down to decision superiority. In the Russian Navy, a commander like the one aboard Yagal may have needed instructions from higher headquarters before even launching a drone. In the U.S. Navy, the tactical action officer on Arleigh Burke has delegated authority to defend the force without waiting for Washington. The American response chain from detection to missile launch is measured in seconds. The Russian one is often measured in minutes. By the time Moscow would have realized the drone had been shot down, USS Florida was already rising from the water. By the time retreat orders could have been considered, the Growlers had already disrupted the ship's communications. For the full 12 minutes of the engagement, the U.S. Navy stayed several moves ahead of the Russian decision cycle. That is what decades of investment in network-centric warfare produce. Russia has large missiles, it has fast ships, but it does not have the same web. It does not have the same ability to connect a British sensor, a French carrier, and an American missile into one seamless action. Without that link, what remains is a group of isolated platforms vulnerable to a force that can think and move as one. And despite all the advanced hardware, from the standard ERAM missiles to billion-dollar submarines, the night still belonged to the sailors. Think about the crew of HMS Richmond. They took the laser hit, stayed composed, held position, recorded the data, and passed it up the chain. That information later helped the U.S. Navy identify the electronic signature of Russian jamming attempts. Think about the tactical action officer on Arleigh Burke. He watched a Russian vessel make a move that could have triggered disaster, and he did not hesitate. He followed the escalation ladder exactly. Stop the threat, blind the aggressor, then show overwhelming control. When the sun came up over the Bay of Biscay at 6 a.m., Charles de Gaulle was still launching aircraft. Its flight deck was buzzing as if nothing had happened. The American destroyer had returned to its plane guard position. USS Florida had slipped beneath the surface again, invisible once more. There were no proud headlines in Russian media celebrating a daring move. There was silence. Because how do you explain that an advanced spy ship ended up dominated by a single U.S. destroyer and a submarine that appeared from nowhere? Russia's move in the Bay of Biscay was not just a tactical misstep. It was a strategic error with long-term consequences. Moscow tried to use the Shadow Fleet and Gray Zone tactics to show that NATO was weak. Instead, it proved the opposite. NATO is more connected than ever. The U.S. Navy's response was not driven by emotion. It was professional, deliberate, and exact. They did not simply stop an attack. They removed the Russian ship's ability to function as a meaningful military actor in that part of the battle space. The lesson is impossible to miss. The Gray Zone is no longer a safe hiding place. Whether the challenge comes through lasers in the North Sea or drones in the Bay of Biscay, the U.S. Navy's network is already watching. And if that line is crossed, the answer will not be limited to a protest note. It will come from a connected force built to respond faster, farther, and with total clarity. For the world's strongest navy, this was not a dramatic crisis. It was routine enforcement of control at sea. Russia tried to move a piece on the board. The U.S. Navy reminded everyone who still controls the board. For the sailors on Arleigh Burke, the mission ended the same way many others do. Shift change, breakfast, and back to readiness. The Russian move had been recorded, analyzed, and shut down. And as the Eagle made its way back toward the Baltic, its crew likely understood one chilling reality. In a real war, that 12-minute encounter would not have ended with a surfaced submarine. It could have ended with nothing left to say at all. What part of this response stands out most to you? The fact that the U.S. Navy used French sensor data to guide an intercept, or the psychological impact of a nuclear submarine surfacing right beside a Russian intelligence ship? Russia's Shadow Fleet strategy has taken a major blow. But the Gray Zone contest at sea is far from finished. Share your tactical take in the comments. We read them closely to see who really understands where naval dominance is heading. To stay up to date on the real mechanics behind the kill web and watch more deep dives into how modern naval power actually works, subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you the technology, the tactics, and the details that often get overlooked. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon. The U.S. Navy definitely does.